for the new Trump administration, but in all seriousness, whether the president-elect will stick with his campaign promises, and if so, can they be enacted, are big questions. So we've assembled a panel of experts who have mostly conservative leanings to help us understand just how enormous some of those challenges are. Lanhee Chen served as policy director for Mitt Romney's presidential campaign. He is also a CNN political commentator and a fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. Grover Norquist is president of the conservative group Americans for Tax Reform. MacGuineas is president of the Nonpartisan Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget. And David Frum is a senior editor at The Atlantic and a former speechwriter for George W. Bush. David, I want to start with you on this question of potential conflicts, relationship between Donald Trump, the president, and the Trump businesses. What do you make of their initial responses about how that will be handled?
Not good. I think the first order of business, the very first order of business for Republicans who want to ensure a successful administration is to corruption-proof the administration. It's going to be a big problem. And the surest way to do that is to pass a law formalizing the long tradition that the president must publish his tax returns. It may or may not be possible. The president may or may not be willing to divest himself. But the way for the public to be protected is for people to know what the president has, whether he receives any benefit. Because of the particular nature of Donald Trump's businesses, everything that happens at the Trump organization flows into his tax return. So if we can see the tax return, we can know, is anyone trying to bribe him? Has anyone succeeded?
Grover, the Donald Trump campaigned on draining the swamp. He campaigned on getting rid of the self-dealing in Washington. It was not a small issue. So when Mike Pence was kind of vague, he said, trust me, it'll all get worked out. Wouldn't you expect kind of brighter lines from a candidate who spends so much time talking about changing Washington?
Yeah, and look, you want to change all of Washington. The focus on Trump is interesting, but there's a House, there's a Senate, there are governors, there's an entire bureaucracy. We need to reduce the amount of money the federal government spends. If you don't want people stealing some of it, the best way to do that is to have less of it spent. Very important that the Republicans maintain their ban on earmarks. That earmarks have been the currency of corruption in Washington, D.C. for years and years and years. The Republicans ended that. Some people want to bring it back. We should make sure, one, we stop that, and two, instead of having money for roads come to Washington, D.C., where we then send it back out with a series of regulations and strings on it, including the Davis-Bacon Act, which is a racist act passed in the 1930s to keep African Americans from competing in those jobs. It should be repealed simply because it's racist. But it also raises the cost of building anything in the United States that the federal government touches by 25 to 33%. We should, one, get rid of the Davis-Bacon Act. West Virginia just got rid of their version of the Davis-Bacon Act. Wisconsin did. A number of states abolished that. We should at the federal level, and we should let states raise their own money and build their own roads. You bring trillions into Washington, D.C. to spend, will corrupt things.
Lanhee, Grover just had a nice detailed list there of things that need to be done. So that's one area. But still, back to the president, who is no small actor in politics in Washington. What could he do? What other than what David suggested, which is publishing those tax returns, what else might you expect from a president who ran so forcefully on the idea of changing the way Washington works in terms of his own relationships?
Well, I think certainly he should hold himself to a higher standard. And if there are concerns particularly about what's happening within the dealings in his family business, he should think about ways to put up more vigorous firewalls, frankly, between what his family is doing with the business and what he might be doing with the people's business as president. So I think it's important for him to think about that. I think this issue of lobbyists also is important. I think that the administration, or the president-elect's administration, kind of turning around and saying, look, we are going to make a serious effort to ensure that there isn't the kind of revolving door that we may have seen in previous administrations. By putting in place, for example, this 5-year ban, I think that's a great idea. Remember, the essence of the Trump candidacy is as the outsider. And it's crucially important for his credibility, but also the credibility of Republicans who were elected with him, for him to behave in a way that is completely above reproach.
All right, let me ask you now, switching and going back to Grover's point a little bit, the budget. So we have promises that were made on the campaign trail, and then we have the reality of the budget. Where should people trying to figure out where the rubber meets the road, what should they look to?
Right. So first, for starters, President-elect Trump is going to be inheriting the worst fiscal situation of any president as judged by the debt relative to the economy, other than President Truman when he's walking into office. So he's got a tough starting point. He spent a lot of time on the campaign talking about the importance of getting that $20 trillion debt back down. And yet, we looked at the proposals that he put forth during the campaign. They would, in fact, add over $5 trillion to the national debt. And that's on top of borrowing $9 trillion that we are poised to do if we do nothing. So he has a huge challenge ahead of him. He's also going to be working with a Republican Congress that for years has said it's very important to balance the budget over a 10-year period. The question is, now that they have the House, the Senate, and the White House, are they suddenly going to pull back from those fiscal goals because he has these unpaid for tax cuts, infrastructure spending, increases in defense, a lot of things that would actually balloon the debt? Or are they going to hold to those fiscal goals, which are very important for both getting the debt under control and actually helping to grow the economy, which is the other major goal?
You know, John, I think the flip side of that also is Donald Trump during the campaign did not say very much about Medicare or Social Security. Now remember, the three biggest drivers of federal deficit and debt going forward are healthcare spending, Social Security, and net interest on the debt. So unless we do something about those quickly, this is a problem like compounding interest is a good thing when you invest. This is the opposite of that. And so it is crucially important, and I'm glad to see, by the way, that Republicans have begun to focus on Medicare reform, because that is the more intractable, I think, of the two problems between Medicare and Social Security. But it's also important for him, I think, to revisit what he said during the campaign, which is that he didn't want to touch Social Security.
That's right.
I think it's important that we look at things like the retirement age and also the growth of benefits.
But there's something kind of surreal about this, because we are in a city now that has had for a long time a two-party system. And it's now a three-party system. There's a Republican Party, a Democratic Party, and a Trump Party. And the Republican Party has priorities, and Lanhee is the eminent expert on what those are and should be, and they're right and important. But the president also has his own priorities, and they are summed up with that photograph of him with those dubious Indian businessmen giving the thumbs up sign that was tweeted out. And what is going to be very important is for the Republican Party to accomplish its goals, it must prevent the Trump Party from accomplishing its goals, which are of a very different and much dirtier order.
You can start where there's tremendous agreement. The tax proposal that Trump has put forward is very similar to the one that's been put forward by the House Republicans, Brady in the Ways and Means Committee, and Paul Ryan, taking the corporate rate from 35 to 20 or 15, I prefer Trump's 15, but 20's progress, would be tremendous for economic growth. Going to full expensing, which both plans haven't, would shoot up growth. You'd look at growth going from 2% to 4%. And the most important thing that the President and the House and Senate can do is get economic growth back on path. We've had a very anemic growth, a recovery. We've been in recovery for 7.5 years, but it's been the lousiest recovery in a long time. We need to be growing at 4%. If you grow for a decade at 4% instead of 2%, the federal government nets $5+ trillion in additional revenue.
Have we ever
from
grown
higher
at
taxes
4% for 10 years?
under Reagan? Yes.
Well, he was only president for 8. But
No, but out until Bush decided to raise taxes and undo.
So let me
much
point
of
out
his
some of the
leadership.
differences, though, because as a big proponent of tax reform, there actually are some important differences, which is the Donald Trump tax plan would lose trillions of dollars, where the members of the Republican Party are saying tax reform should be revenue neutral. And I think that's a really important objective.
With dynamic scoring. which is
Because
very
to
important.
add up with spending proposals, taking entitlements off the table, which I think is a very unwise idea and really stands in the way of getting this done, and dealing with the debt, you can't have a big loss from your tax reform. In terms of growing the economy, there's a big difference now than when we saw growth before. Right now, our economy is projected to grow at about 2%, and Donald Trump talked about growth rates of twice or 3 times that much. But we have a big challenge, which is changing demographics. As the baby boomers all move into retirement, in order to get those higher growth rates, you'd have to have productivity levels we've actually never seen in this country. So I think one thing that's really important here is let's aspire to grow the economy. You do that through tax reform, through public investments, but you also do that for paying for your proposals and controlling the debt. But let's not wish for it and assume sort of magical numbers that are unlikely to materialize.
If you want to do those things, and the things that Grover's talking about, I would agree with all of them, more or less. If you want to do those things, you have to prevent this administration from being devoured and consumed by scandal. Donald Trump has made it pretty clear his plan is to run the least transparent and probably the least ethical administration in a long, long time. If any of this is to happen, this administration must be Trump-proofed. The president is up to no good. He's made that very clear. He's indicating to the Japanese, if you've got business with me, this is the person to talk to. He's indicating to the Indians, if you have business with me, these are the people to talk to. If he does that, I guarantee 18 months from now, when you convene the show, you will not be talking about taxes, you'll not be talking about that, you will be talking about the latest Trump scandal. Act now to save the country, the political system and the Republican Party from the things this president seems to have in mind.
Let me ask another question, Lanhee, of you about other ways capital can be spent, which is, we've talked about budget and tax reform, but there are other things Trump has on the priorities list. Immigration is one of them. How hard do you think that will be, and do you think that will expend some capital in terms of political capital that then can't be used on these very hard other things, tax reform, Medicare, and so forth?
I think it's a very dangerous thing to start with. I mean, obviously it was a campaign priority, so it's important to the president-elect. We recognize that that's going to be a priority for this administration. But you think about all of the other important issues, and we've talked about some of them, certainly tax reform. What's going to happen with Obamacare? This is something that has been a signature issue for Republicans for the last 6 years since the law was passed and signed into law. What is going to be done in terms of the repeal? And more importantly, I think, is the question about what you're going to replace it with. You know, I'm a little alarmed that we seem to be thinking that we can kick the can down the road on the replacement of the Affordable Care Act. There are some very important policy goals that Republicans have been working to accomplish for some time. For example, parity in the tax treatment of health care between those who get their health care from their employers and those who buy it on their own. That is something that should be a focus of the discussion, and we need to be focusing on that first, I think, rather than some of these other issues, which frankly I don't think have as much potential to grow the economy, certainly not in the way that Mr. Trump has talked about them.
Grover?
Well, I think on health care, and Trump has spoken to this, allowing people from New Jersey to buy their insurance from companies in Iowa, allowing you to cross borders. Even the government said that would drop the cost about 15%. That's an important reform that makes all the other reforms easier. We need to get spending down as well as regulations. We've been talking about taxes, but the Reduce Act that Ken Calvert has put forward to reduce the number of civilian employees at the Pentagon by 15%. They've grown 15% in the Bush-Obama years.
But they're going to grow more under Donald Trump, who's talking about a big plus up in spending on defense.
First of all, he wants to talk about putting more troops on, but I'm talking about the civilian employees. Troops have gone down 4% during that period. The civilian population has gone up 15%. What Reduce Act does is simply takes it back down 15%, back to where it had been compared to the number of troops you have. That saves $80 billion in 5 years. That's an important reform, and if we're going to do more on the military in some areas, we need to get rid of the wasteful spending that we don't need to do. And Calvert's got a very important bill.
Let me ask, add to whatever your answer is going to be in the last 40 seconds here. Donald Trump, $1 trillion infrastructure bill. How does that fit in the coming budget? What challenges that exist?
Right. So infrastructure is one of the few areas where both Democrats and Republicans tend to agree that we need to do more spending there. But if you look at what the Congressional Budget Office found, we know that infrastructure can be a very important component of an economic growth strategy. But they also found that if you borrow to do that, it will actually shrink the economy. The same way that Wharton found that if you borrow to do a big tax cut, it could shrink the economy. So I think the problem that we have, the big challenge is, one, Grover's focusing on the spending. That's really the smaller parts of the budget. I think we need to look at the big parts of the budget. Back to entitlements, that's 50% of the budget, 75% of the growth. And two, if you want to grow the economy, you can't borrow your way to growth. We have to get control of the national debt. So they're going to have to make choices. That's what budgets are. It's about choices. We are moving from campaigning to governing, and now we have to look at the real choices.
All right, we're going to have to stop it there. We'll look forward to come back and talk about the choices later. Thanks to all of you. And I want to be